A time approaches when humanity, driven by self-interest, is bringing about its own downfall. As people indulge in their pleasures, the planet suffers. Glaciers melt, permafrost thaws, and ancient viruses and bacteria, dormant for millions of years, awaken with lethal intent. Governments pour their last resources into launching rockets to evacuate survivors, but with no clear destination, most likely perish, either from cosmic radiation or from turning on each other in desperate fights over dwindling supplies. The Earth, weary yet wise, rids itself from its greatest threat: humans. A few manage to survive, retreating to the mountains, far from the infected zones. Their numbers are unknown. Among them is Eve, accompanied by Arthur, an aging military robot damaged in the climate wars. Rusty and battered, he looks more like a drifter than a machine built for combat, yet he remains programmed to protect Eve, though from what exactly remains uncertain. Today, he prepares to venture into the abandoned city, despite Arthur's warnings about the dangers. He insists she must never drink the water there. Unfazed, Eve reminds him to keep an eye on their base while she's gone. When Arthur expresses confusion, she explains it was a joke, something he theoretically understands but can never truly grasp. Eve drives along a debris-littered road, remnants of a lost civilization scattered around her. She reaches an abandoned supermarket, gathers supplies, and for reasons even she can't explain, pockets a packet of lavender seeds, though the chances of them sprouting are slim. Before leaving, she scribbles a note on a wall, marking her location in hopes that someone someday will see it. Back at the base, Arthur immediately demands the password before letting her in. Eve responds, then playfully recounts her day, a shopping spree, coffee with a friend, and a concert in the evening. The sarcasm is lost on Arthur, and Eve promises to tweak his visual system one day. Each time she unloads the car, Arthur demands the password again, irritating her. Eventually, she decides to test him by giving the wrong response, and in return, Arthur threatens her with his weapon. Accepting that humor is beyond him, Eve drops the joke. After a cleansing shower, she tries once more to reach someone on the radio, but the static remains unbroken. That night, she waters her greenhouse plants, documents the little she knows, repairs broken equipment, and bounces a ball off the wall, small distractions in an empty world. Meanwhile, Arthur patrols their small perimeter, standing guard against unseen threats. The next morning, Eve installs solar panels and suggests a game of riddles. Arthur answers the first one with ease, then offers one of his own. They continue until Eve poses a question only a human can comprehend. Arthur, stumped, asks for the answer, but Eve merely laughs, satisfied at finally outsmarting him. In jest, she proposes marriage. Arthur, ever literal, recites the dictionary definition and states their union is impossible. Eve bitterly responds that he is all she has left. She recounts how her father built the base before leaving for his unit in the war, bringing Arthur back from a warehouse along the way. He promised to return in a few days, but the days stretched into years. If she were to marry anyone, it would have to be the robot. Arthur, missing the joke, remarks that a faulty spouse could be problematic. Eve quips that she could always replace him with a newer model, though replacements don't always work. Maybe they really are the last two beings on Earth. Arthur has no way of knowing. His database only goes up to 2040, when the world's population was still 9.5 billion. Eve tells him she leaves coordinates in the restricted zone regularly, but Arthur doesn't understand why. Who would see them? Who is left? When she reminds him of the three fundamental robot laws: protect humans, obey orders, and preserve itself unless it conflicts with the first two, Arthur recites them flawlessly. But he also points out that he was built as a patrol unit, not a resource gatherer, and his primary function is to keep intruders out. Anyone who doesn't know the password is an intruder. She reminds him of the climate wars, where border robots like him prevented desperate refugees from entering the north. India, suffering from catastrophic heat and a severe water crisis, saw people and animals dying in the streets. Their only hope was to escape, but thousands of robots lined the borders, leading to the largest massacre in human history. A genocide of those simply trying to survive. Arthur's memory of that time was wiped, but if Eve had known his password, she could have reprogrammed him long ago. Instead, he's stuck in an endless loop, patrolling an empty world when she needs a robot that can actually help her. With the panels installed, Eve prepares for Christmas. She wonders what to get Arthur, but he reminds her robots don't receive gifts. Frustrated, she calls him a soulless machine and urges him to at least pretend to have emotions. As night falls, Arthur finds her and admits he does want something: a new eye. Eve promises to handle it after decorating their tree. When he again asks for the answer to the riddle, she refuses. That evening, she tends to her routine, then pulls out an old box of Christmas decorations. The next morning, she tells Arthur she's heading out to find an artificial tree since real ones no longer exist. As usual, he warns her of the risks: wear a suit, take extra oxygen, and never drink the water. She loads her supplies, but upon returning, Arthur stands in her way. "Password," he demands. Eve instinctively recites the old one, but Arthur denies her entry. The password updated that morning as it does every 3 months. The new one is written in a book inside the base, but she can't get to it without getting past Arthur. She throws out every word she can think of, but it's useless. How could she possibly guess one word among millions? She tries reasoning with him, reminding him she's the only one left, maybe the last human alive. Is this how she dies, locked out of her own home, left to perish over a forgotten password? Desperate, she attempts to push past him, but Arthur raises his weapon. He isn't bluffing. She steps back, searching for a way out. His patrol route is limited. If she moves strategically, she might find a solution. After a while, Eve approaches again, calm and composed. Casually, she says she needs an axe to chop down a tree and will provide the password as soon as she's inside. Arthur suddenly questions why she still carries an axe when there are no trees left. Eve tries once again to convince the robot to grant her access. After all, he knows her well. Arthur acknowledges that he recognizes her, but firmly states that entry requires the correct password. Desperate, Eve bargains. He can let her glance at the password for just a moment and everything will be fine. If she fails to say the correct word, he can eliminate her. But Arthur refutes this idea. His core directive is to protect humans, not harm them. The only person he could ever destroy is a stranger, an intruder, someone who does not know the password. Realizing she is at an impasse, Eve backs away. She spends the night outside, occasionally throwing stones at the robot, though she never forces him to abandon his post. At dawn, Eve devises another plan. She turns her clothes inside out, conceals her face, and approaches Arthur, posing as a refugee seeking asylum. She recalls Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which grants individuals the right to seek refuge from persecution. Arthur acknowledges her claim but insists that she must step away from the generator while he processes her request. She complies, briefly disappearing before returning in her normal attire. Arthur promptly informs her that a stranger had visited the day before and now a refugee has also appeared. Eve instructs him to provide water to the refugee should she return. Disappearing once more, she changes her outfit and reemerges in disguise. As the refugee, she requests water, but Arthur does not comply immediately. Instead, he interrogates her, seeking to determine whether she is a political or climate refugee. Eve declares herself a political refugee, knowing that climate refugees have no legal protections. However, Arthur demands proof that she faced persecution. She reminds him that the NAA Convention does not require refugees to provide evidence, but Arthur remains firm. A refugee must justify why remaining in their country was impossible. Frustrated, Eve recounts her story. Her home was reduced to ashes, her family murdered, and her life constantly under threat. Arthur accepts this as a valid reason but insists she provide documentation. Exasperated, Eve argues that a war refugee would have no documents to present. Unfazed, Arthur begins listing bureaucratic procedures, applications for border services, and the like. Furious, Eve abandons the pretense and simply begs for water. Arthur assures her he will provide it, but only after he has first given water to Eve, who is already suffering from dehydration. Another night passes by the generator. In the morning, she makes one last attempt, but upon seeing Arthur still standing guard, she finally gives up. Arthur questions her certainty that no other humans remain. After all, where did the stranger and refugee come from? Too exhausted to argue, Eve dismisses his logic. Arthur then mentions a nearby station that has been operational for a century, implying that someone must still be maintaining it. Eve assumes that only automated systems remain, mindlessly continuing their work. Arthur, bound by his programming, refuses to carry anything off the base. In a cruel paradox, his duty to protect Eve ultimately results in her demise. Eve stares toward the distant station, convinced it is just another unthinking machine, stuck in an infinite loop awaiting confirmation for shutdown. Searching her vehicle for water, she finds nothing. Instead, she discovers a small packet of lavender seeds. With no other option, she plants them in the barren soil and pleads for them to grow. In a last-ditch effort, she offers Arthur a trade, the answer to the riddle about the 3 robots in exchange for entry. But Arthur remains unmoved. Desperate, she offers the answer for just a sip of water, yet the robot does not respond. Eve decides to risk everything and makes her way to the station despite her dwindling oxygen supply. She scales the structure, then lowers herself into a vast pipe. The facility is lifeless, save for the occasional blinking lights on a control panel. She searches frantically but finds nothing useful. Just as her air supply reaches critical levels, she stumbles upon a locked door with bottles on the other side. With no other choice, she smashes a small window with her axe and forces her way in, only to discover that every bottle is empty. She no longer bothers to shield herself from exposure. Continuing her search, she hears the faint sound of dripping water but ignores it, recalling Arthur's warning. With nothing left to gain, she returns to the plateau, climbs into her vehicle, and rams straight into Arthur. The explosion is massive, but the robot remains intact. By morning, Arthur finds Eve barely clinging to life. He reports that a stranger had attempted to breach the perimeter the previous night. Now the stranger and the refugee both remain behind the generator. Eve begs him for water, but Arthur refuses to abandon his post. In her delirium, she sees a vision of her father urging her to drink. When she regains some awareness, Arthur repeats his demand. Either she provides the password or she will die. Later, Eve manages to collect raindrops from the roof, but her body rejects them, and she vomits. Bitterly, she remarks that if Arthur were her husband, he would surely help her. But Arthur merely observes that her time is running out. That night, she dreams of a city filled with the laughter of children. By morning, Arthur again asks for the answer to the riddle of the three robots. Eve, barely able to move, crawls toward him, rises to her feet for a brief moment, then collapses. In her final moments, she finds herself in the city once more, pondering how to outsmart the machine. Arthur finally reveals the truth. When she dies, his emergency protocol will activate, resetting the password. He will be left alone, but he still believes the stranger and refugee exist, which means humanity endures. With her last breath, Eve asks Arthur to water the lavender she planted. She dies. Arthur accepts the final password, lavender. A slow-burning, melancholic drama with an inevitable, tragic end, the story leaves a lasting impact, especially considering its opening claim that it may be based on real events. In the end, it seems humanity was destined to lose its battle against the machine.